It had been almost 7 years since the divorce when I found myself driving down that same winding road again, the one that led past my ex-husband's old cabin. The road hadn't changed much since the last time I'd seen it, still narrow and uneven, with tall pine trees leaning in from both sides like they were trying to swallow the path whole. The sun had already dropped low behind the tree line, leaving the world dim and colorless. The air had that stillness that comes before night settles in completely, the kind where every sound carries a little too far. I hadn't planned to come this way. It was supposed to be a shortcut to the main highway, but part of me wondered if I'd taken this route on purpose, maybe to face something I'd been avoiding all these years. Back when Mark and I bought that cabin in 2013, it was supposed to be our escape, a quiet place away from the city, surrounded by forest and silence. We'd only had it for 3 years before everything fell apart. I hadn't seen it since, not even after he passed away last winter. The news came through an old friend, saying Mark had died alone up there, heart failure or something close to it. I didn't ask for details. It wasn't my place anymore. But as I drove past the stretch of woods I recognized too well, something inside me tightened. The thought of that cabin sitting there, half-rotten and forgotten, was like an itch I couldn't ignore. I slowed the car when I saw the turnoff, barely a visible break between the trees. The dirt path was overgrown, branches scraping the side of my car as I turned in. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, nothing more. Maybe it was some kind of closure. The deeper I drove, the darker it got. The trees blocked out what little light was left. The road hadn't been maintained for years, and the tires crunched over loose stones and sticks. I remembered this same drive years ago when everything was green and alive, when Mark had his arm out the window, laughing about how this place would be ours forever. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, just as I remembered, but smaller now, almost sunken into the earth. The wood had darkened with age, the roof sagging in the middle. The front porch was covered in leaves and debris. The windows were dirty, and the old pickup that used to sit out front was gone. I parked a few feet away, turned off the engine, and sat there listening. No birds, no wind, just the quiet hum of the car cooling down. I should have left right then, but I didn't. When I stepped out, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, old soil, something faintly metallic underneath. The kind of smell that comes from a place that hasn't been opened in too long. The air was cooler here, and the forest felt heavier, like it pressed in from all directions. My boots sank into soft earth as I made my way up the small path. The front steps creaked under my weight. I noticed the door was slightly open, just enough for the wind to move it. That was strange. Mark had always kept the place locked tight. I pushed it open with my hand, and the hinges groaned. Inside, it was almost exactly as it had been left. The same old furniture, a couple of framed pictures still hanging on the walls, though the glass in one of them had cracked. Dust coated everything, and cobwebs hung from the corners. The air was thick and stale. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter. It left a trail through the dust. The table was still set for one, like he'd planned to eat but never did. There was a plate, a fork, and a cup turned upside down. I remembered how Mark used to eat in silence here, especially after we started drifting apart. He'd stare out that same window overlooking the trees, lost somewhere I couldn't reach. There was a faint mark on the floor near the window, like something heavy had been dragged across the boards. I followed it with my eyes, seeing it disappear near the hallway. My chest tightened a little. I didn't want to think too hard about it. Instead, I moved toward the small living area. His old leather chair was still there, cracked and faded, the same blanket draped over the back. A few papers were scattered on the floor near it, maybe letters or bills. I crouched down and picked one up. It was a note, barely legible, written in shaky handwriting. Just a list of random words, maybe things he needed to buy. One word stood out though: visitor. It was written twice, underlined. I stared at it for a while, then folded it and set it back where I found it. The air in the room felt colder. Maybe it was because the windows didn't seal right anymore, but it made the hair on my arms rise. I decided to check the bedroom, half out of curiosity, half to convince myself there was nothing strange about any of this. The hallway was darker, narrower than I remembered. I used my phone light to see. The wallpaper had peeled off in long strips, exposing damp wood beneath. A faint sound echoed as I walked, like the groan of old floorboards shifting under pressure somewhere deeper inside. The bedroom door was half open. I pushed it slowly. The smell in there was worse, stronger, heavier. The bed was still made, but the blanket was rumpled, like someone had been sleeping there recently. On the nightstand sat a small bottle of pills, half empty, and an old wallet. I looked inside and saw Mark's ID, faded and cracked. It was strange seeing his face again like that. He'd been only 48 when he died, but in that photo he looked much younger. I set it back down. My phone light caught something else near the floor. A box pushed against the wall. Pulled it out. Inside were old photos, letters, and a few tools. Most of it didn't matter, but at the bottom was a small notebook, the cover stained. I opened it to random pages. Notes about the weather, the woods, small repairs he'd done. But then the tone changed a few pages in. He'd written about noises outside at night, footsteps on the porch, tools going missing. He mentioned waking up one morning to find his axe stuck in a tree near the door, even though he hadn't used it. The last few entries were almost unreadable, the writing shaky and uneven. The last one said, asterisk. I heard them again last night, not sure if I'm imagining it. Asterisk. I closed the notebook and stood up. A cold unease crawled up my back. Maybe he'd just been paranoid or sick. Maybe it was the isolation. But something about the way he wrote felt desperate. I left the room quickly and headed back toward the main door. The floor creaked louder behind me than before. I stopped and listened, but it was just the house settling. Still, my chest felt tight, and I picked up my pace. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. Sharper, fresher, but also heavier somehow. It was nearly dark now. The forest had turned into a wall of black trunks and branches. I could barely see my car through the trees. I started walking toward it, but halfway down the path, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Fresh ones, small but deep, like from boots. They weren't mine. They led away from the porch into the woods. My first thought was that someone else had been here, maybe squatters or hunters. That thought didn't comfort me. I stood there staring until a sound broke through the trees. A dull metallic clang, like something hitting metal far away. My hands started shaking, and I hurried to the car. I drove off fast, the tires spinning on loose gravel before catching traction. The headlights barely cut through the darkness. I kept checking the rearview mirror even though I couldn't see anything behind me but trees and shadows. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were slick with sweat. The cabin faded into the darkness behind me, swallowed by the forest again. I didn't tell anyone about what I found there. Not about the notebook, not about the footprints. A few weeks later, I read in the local news that the cabin had burned down. The report said it was likely due to faulty wiring, though there hadn't been any power running to the place in years. No one was hurt. No remains were found. I didn't go back. I still drive that same highway sometimes, and every time I pass that stretch of road, I keep my eyes straight ahead. I never look down the turnoff, even though I can feel it there, hidden in the trees, the dirt path that used to lead to what was once our home. Whatever was left of Mark's life, and whatever was in those woods that last night he spent alive. It's all gone now, burned away with that cabin. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind moves just right, I catch myself thinking about that word he wrote twice. Asterisk visitor asterisk, and I wonder if it was ever really just in his head. was early October of 2014 when I decided to stay at my uncle's old farm cabin in the outskirts of Nebraska. I was 28 back then, working construction jobs off and on, trying to save enough money to move out of the city. My uncle had passed away the year before, and the property had been sitting empty since then. He'd lived there alone for most of his life after his wife died, and the place had this heavy, isolated feeling to it even when I was younger. Still, when a friend told me I could stay there rent-free for a while and look after the land, it sounded like a good idea. I figured I'd have peace and quiet, maybe get my head straight. The drive out there was long, mostly flat land and dry cornfields, and the farther I went, the more I realized how far from everything that cabin really was. The nearest town was nearly an hour away. There were no other houses nearby, just the open fields, the wind, and an old gravel road that stretched endlessly in both directions. I reached the place around evening, the sky starting to turn orange behind the distant silos. The cabin sat about 50 yards from the edge of a dead-looking field. It wasn't really a cabin, not like those cozy log ones you see in pictures. It was more like a square wooden house, built cheap and weathered by years of wind and rain. The paint had faded into a dull gray, and the porch was starting to lean on one side. There was a rusty tractor parked near the barn, both tires flat, and a small shed behind it that had half its roof caved in. I remember thinking that if I planned to stay there for a few months, I'd have to clean a lot. Inside, it smelled like dust and oil. The furniture was old but still there. A couch, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a twin bed in the back room. Everything looked untouched, like my uncle had just walked out one day and never returned. There were boots still near the door and an old flannel jacket hanging from a nail. The only sign anyone had been there recently was a couple of beer cans on the porch railing, maybe left by someone who'd wandered through. I unpacked what little I had, some clothes, food, and a blanket, and started a small fire in the stove to keep warm. Nights got cold fast out there. It was so quiet that the sound of the fire crackling felt too loud. You don't realize how much background noise you live with until you're somewhere completely silent. I could hear the wind hitting the walls, and sometimes the wooden boards creaked like footsteps when the air pressure shifted. I told myself it was nothing, just the place settling. The first few days went fine. I cleaned up, mowed the tall grass, and cleared the barn enough to store a few tools. During the day, it felt calm, peaceful even. I'd sit outside on the porch and watch the fields move like waves when the wind passed through. But at night, things felt different. The darkness out there was thick, heavier than I'd ever seen. You couldn't see past the porch light, just blackness stretching in every direction. I started hearing things I couldn't place, too. Not voices, nothing supernatural, just noises that didn't belong. Sometimes, I'd hear a sharp metallic sound, like a gate hitting something, but when I'd check, the gate would be closed. Once I heard what sounded like footsteps in the field behind the cabin. I thought it might be an animal, maybe a stray coyote, but when I shined my flashlight that way, nothing moved. I told myself I was just not used to being alone in that kind of silence. On the 5th night, something strange happened. I woke up around 2 in the morning. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it. A faint scraping noise coming from the backside of the cabin, near the kitchen wall. It sounded like metal dragging against wood. It would stop, then start again, slow and steady. I stayed still for a minute, listening. Then it stopped completely. I tried to go back to sleep, but my eyes kept going to the small window above the bed, watching the black outline of the trees beyond the barn. I finally drifted off around 4. The next morning, I went outside to check. The dirt near the wall looked like it had been disturbed, and there were what looked like faint boot prints leading away from the cabin toward the edge of the field. I didn't recognize them. They weren't mine. I looked around for a bit, but didn't find anything else. I figured it could have been someone passing through. There were people out there who sometimes cut across farmland to hunt or scavenge old barns for metal. I tried not to think much of it. That night, I double-checked the doors before bed. I even pushed a chair under the handle, something I hadn't done before. Around midnight, the wind picked up, whistling through cracks in the window frames. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the same scraping noise again. But this time it was closer, almost like it was inside. I froze, holding my breath. Then came the sound of something brushing against the window glass, slow and deliberate, as if someone was dragging their hand across it. I didn't move. I stayed still until it stopped. After maybe a minute, I forced myself to get up and look outside. The porch light barely reached that side of the house, but I could make out a shape standing near the edge of the barn. It wasn't clear, just a dark outline, but it was definitely a person. They were standing perfectly still, facing the cabin. My stomach dropped. I turned off the light in the bedroom, hoping whoever it was couldn't see me. I waited by the window for a while, watching, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't hear them leave. No footsteps, no rustling in the grass, just gone. The next morning, I decided to drive into town. I told myself I needed supplies, but really I just needed to be around people for a while. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I bought some extra locks and a heavy flashlight, filled up on gas, and headed back before sunset. When I got back, I noticed the shed door was open. I knew I'd closed it before leaving. Inside, a few old tools were scattered on the floor, and one of the wooden crates had been pushed aside, like someone had been searching through it. Nothing was taken, as far as I could tell, but it felt wrong. Whoever was around there knew I wasn't home that day. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me tense. I kept the flashlight beside the bed, ready to grab it at any noise. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something hit the side of the house, hard. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a full-on kick. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window, but before I could look out, I heard another thud, this time near the front porch. My heart was pounding. I turned the light off again and crouched near the door, trying to listen. There was breathing, faint, raspy breathing, just outside the door. I didn't move. The sound stayed there for what felt like minutes. Then I heard slow steps on the porch boards, creaking closer to the window. I thought whoever it was might try to break in, but after a while it stopped. The breathing faded, and then nothing but wind. When daylight finally came, I packed up everything. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded my bag into the truck and took one last look at the cabin. There were clear footprints on the porch, muddy ones. They went from the steps to the window, then disappeared into the field behind the barn. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could, but they just stopped halfway into the tall grass. No sign of anyone. I drove out of there and didn't look back. A week later, I called the county office and told them I wouldn't be staying on the property anymore. A few months later, the land was sold off to some company that leveled most of it. I heard they tore down the cabin too. Sometimes, I still think about that night. The breathing, the way that figure stood still in the dark. Whoever it was, they knew I was alone, and they were waiting. I'll never know what they wanted or how long they'd been watching before I noticed. But every time I see open farmland now, with nothing around but wind and silence, I get that same uneasy feeling in my chest, like I'm back there again, lying awake in that creaking cabin, knowing someone is standing just outside, watching through the glass. It was October of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city and drive up to a small piece of land my uncle left me years ago. It sat a few miles outside of a small town called Wexford, up in the northern part of Maine. The land wasn't much, just a few acres of pine trees, a dirt trail, and a small wooden cabin that hadn't been used in decades. The odd thing about that place was that right behind the cabin, maybe 50 feet away, there was an old graveyard. It wasn't huge, maybe 20 or 30 graves, most of them so old that the stones were leaning and the names had faded away. My uncle used to say it was there long before the cabin was built. I never thought much of it, but that detail always stuck in my head. I was 34 then, single and working long hours in a warehouse job that left me drained. I needed a quiet weekend. I wanted to be away from noise, people, and phones. That Friday, I packed up my old Ford Ranger with a sleeping bag, a cooler of food, and a few tools just in case the cabin needed work. I left around noon and got there by late afternoon. The road got worse the further I went. Muddy ruts, overgrown brush scraping the sides of the truck, branches hanging low enough to hit the windshield. When I finally reached the clearing, the sun was just starting to drop behind the trees. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. The wood had gone gray, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and one of the window frames had cracked and warped. But it was standing. I walked around back and looked toward the graveyard. The stones were still there, half buried under weeds and dry grass. Some were tilted forward, some broken in half. There was no fence, no sign, just a patch of uneven ground with dark, mossy stones scattered like forgotten markers. Inside the cabin, it smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust or damp nails. I opened the shutters to let in what little light was left, swept the floor, and checked the old wood stove. To my surprise, it still worked. I started a fire using dry sticks from outside, and for a while it felt peaceful. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the faint creaking of the cabin as it settled. By the time night came, I had set up my sleeping bag near the stove. The woods outside were quiet. No traffic, no voices, just the faint sounds of crickets and wind. Around 10 or so, the temperature dropped hard. I stepped outside to grab some firewood and noticed how still everything had gotten. No wind, no bugs, just silence. Even the trees seemed frozen in place. The air smelled different, colder, sharper, like the kind of air you smell right before it snows. When I turned toward the graveyard, I noticed something strange. A fresh mound of dirt near one of the old stones. It wasn't large, but it looked new, dark, loose soil piled up like something had been buried recently. I stood there staring at it for a while, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe an animal dug something up, or the ground shifted. But the shape was too even, like someone had shoveled it. I didn't have a flashlight, only the dull light from the cabin window behind me, so I decided to check it out in the morning. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to small noises, creaks, faint thuds, and once, what sounded like a soft scrape from outside. Every time I sat up, the cabin was still and quiet again. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that made my stomach turn. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt outside. It wasn't close, maybe near the edge of the trees, but it lasted several seconds. Then silence again. I told myself it was probably a branch or maybe a deer moving around. I lay awake until dawn. The next morning was gray and damp. The fire had gone out during the night, and everything felt colder than before. I went outside and walked toward the graveyard again. The ground was soft from dew, and the air felt heavy. When I reached the new mound of dirt, I realized it was definitely fresh. The soil was darker, not compacted like the older graves, and there were faint shovel marks. What made it worse was the fact that there was no sign of any digging tools, no tracks, no reason for anyone to have been there. I didn't touch it. I just stood there staring at it for a while, feeling uneasy. The rest of the day, I tried to distract myself, cut some wood, cleaned the inside of the cabin, and walked down the trail toward a nearby creek. But I couldn't shake the thought of that grave. Why would someone bury something here, in a graveyard nobody even visits? By late afternoon, it started raining. The sound of it on the roof was steady and heavy, and the wind picked up. I cooked a can of soup on the stove, sat by the fire, and tried to relax. Around sunset, I looked out the small back window. The graveyard was still visible through the rain, faint shapes of stones half covered in mist. But what caught my eye was a darker shape near that same fresh mound. Something small, low to the ground, not moving. I blinked a few times, thinking maybe I was seeing things through the rain, but it stayed there. It looked like a person crouched down, but too still. I didn't go outside. Not that night. The rain kept pouring, and every few minutes the wind would howl hard enough to rattle the windows. I stayed near the fire, but my nerves were tight. Around midnight, I heard that dragging sound again, this time much closer. It came from behind the cabin, near the back wall where my bed was. The sound moved slowly across the dirt, stopping now and then continuing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After what felt like an hour, it stopped completely. I didn't sleep after that. When morning came, the rain had stopped. The air smelled fresh but cold, and a thin fog hung over the ground. I stepped outside, exhausted. The first thing I did was look toward the graveyard. The fresh mound of dirt was gone. The soil was scattered flat, like it had been smoothed out during the night. There was no sign of the dark shape I saw before, no footprints, nothing. But near where it had been, I saw something half buried in the mud. A shovel, old, rusty, but clearly used. Its handle was damp and splintered, like it had been left out overnight. I walked over, picked it up, and saw dirt clinging to the blade. My stomach turned. I dropped it back down and backed away. Whoever had been out there must have been digging during the night. But for what? I packed up my things that same morning. I didn't care about the rest of the weekend or fixing the place up. I just wanted to leave. As I loaded my truck, I noticed deep marks near the side of the cabin. Long streaks in the dirt, like something had been dragged from the back wall toward the graveyard. It looked like the same dragging I'd heard. The soil was disturbed, the grass flattened. Before leaving, I took one last look at the graveyard. In the pale light, I noticed one of the oldest headstones lying flat, its base torn up like it had been lifted or moved. Beneath where it had stood, the dirt was darker and softer than the rest, freshly disturbed. I didn't stay to find out what was under it. I drove out of there as the fog lifted, not looking back once. When I got into town, I stopped for gas and told the old man at the counter that someone had been digging around the graves near my uncle's place. He said there hadn't been any caretakers up there in decades. The graves were from the 1800s, people from an old logging camp that burned down long ago. He told me the land had been abandoned ever since. I sold that land a few months later, never went back. Sometimes I still think about that night. The dragging, the sound of the shovel in the dirt, the fresh mound that disappeared. I try to tell myself it was just some drifter, maybe someone hiding something, maybe just my tired mind making things worse in the dark. But every now and then, I wake up in the middle of the night and swear I can still hear that slow, heavy dragging sound somewhere outside my window. And every time I hear it, I remember how the dirt under that old headstone looked freshly turned, like something had been taken out, not buried. It was late October, 2017, when I decided to take a week off work and head out to the small hunting cabin my father used to take me to when I was younger. The cabin sat deep inside a patch of forest in northern Michigan, about 6 miles off the main road. I hadn't been there in years, not since Dad passed away, but I'd been wanting a quiet place to clear my head. I packed my rifle, a few days' worth of food, a small cooler, and some basic tools. The drive took about 4 hours from my home in Grand Rapids, and by the time I reached the turnoff that led to the dirt trail, the sky was already getting that dim orange color that happens just before dusk. The road that led to the cabin wasn't really a road anymore. It was more like a rough path carved into the woods, half covered by fallen leaves and tree roots that had broken through the dirt over the years. My truck shook the whole way, branches scraping the sides, the smell of pine and damp soil slipping through the cracked windows. I hadn't seen another car or person since I'd turned off the highway. When I finally pulled up to the clearing, I cut the engine and sat there for a minute, listening. It was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, no sound at all except for the ticking of my cooling engine. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it, just more weathered. The paint was long gone from the wooden walls, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. The porch steps creaked under my boots, and when I pushed the door open, a puff of stale air drifted out, thick with dust and something that smelled faintly of old wood smoke. I flicked on my flashlight and swept it across the small room. 2 chairs, a table, the old wood stove, and a cot against the far wall. The last time I'd been there had been some old photos of deer hunts tacked to the walls, but they'd all curled up and fallen to the floor. I dropped my gear, opened the shutters to let in some light, and started getting the place in shape. I swept the dust, set up my sleeping bag, and unpacked some food. The silence in that place was strange. It felt thick, like the air itself was listening. I told myself it was just the isolation. I was used to hearing traffic and people, and being out there alone after so many years was bound to feel strange. That first night, I built a fire outside and cooked some canned chili over it. The stars were bright enough to see without a flashlight, and the sky stretched wider than I'd seen in a long time. I felt calm for the first time in months. When I finally went inside, I locked the door, turned off the lantern, and lay on the cot. I could hear the trees creaking outside and the soft clicking of cooling metal from the stove. I fell asleep thinking maybe this trip wasn't such a bad idea. But around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a sound that woke me, it was more like a feeling, the way your body just knows something's wrong. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. Then I heard it. Faint crunching, like footsteps moving across the leaves outside. Slow, careful. The sound stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavier than that. They moved past the window, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it shook the cot. I reached for my rifle, which was propped against the wall next to me. I held it close but didn't move toward the window. The steps went quiet again, and after a minute or two, all I could hear was the wind starting to pick up. I told myself it was probably an animal, tried to calm down, and eventually drifted back to sleep, though not deeply. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I checked around the cabin. The ground was damp from a light rain overnight, so it was easy to see prints. They weren't deer tracks. They were boot prints, heavy ones, leading from the tree line, circling the cabin twice, and then heading off toward the woods again. My stomach turned when I saw how fresh they looked. I knelt down and could still see the sharp edges in the mud, not smudged or washed away. That's when I realized how far I really was from anyone else. The nearest town was about an hour away, and I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, only that I'd be gone for the week. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to feel like I'd been scared off. Instead, I decided I'd stay one more night and keep my gun close. That day, I didn't do much hunting. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I looked into the trees, I half expected to see someone standing there, but there was never anything. Around noon, I found something strange near the old fire pit about 50 yards from the cabin. Someone had been there recently. There were ashes that hadn't been fully scattered and a few cigarette butts half buried in the dirt. My father never smoked, and I hadn't been there in years. I stepped back and scanned the woods again, my pulse racing. Whoever had walked around the cabin last night had probably camped nearby. That night, I barely slept. I sat inside with the lantern turned low, rifle across my lap, staring at the door. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was closer, right outside. A quiet metallic sound, like someone brushing against the porch railing. Then the steps again, slow and deliberate. My throat felt dry, and every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to call out, but I didn't. I just waited, listening as the steps moved to the side of the cabin and then stopped. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, without warning, there was a light tap on the window. Just one. Then silence. I froze, staring at the dark glass. The sound hadn't been a knock exactly, more like the tap of a finger. I stayed perfectly still until the sun started coming up, barely blinking. When I finally stepped outside that morning, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the window where I'd heard the tap, there was a clear smear mark, like a handprint, but not pressed flat, more like someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. The prints were faint but visible enough to see. I backed away slowly, looking toward the woods. The boot tracks were there again, this time fresh and deeper, leading right up to the porch steps and then back toward the trees. I didn't waste any time after that. I packed my gear as fast as I could, loaded the truck, and started driving. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the key. As I bumped along the dirt path back to the road, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just trees closing in on both sides. When I reached the main road, I finally stopped and stepped out to breathe. My heart was still racing, but I felt relief wash over me. As I leaned against the truck, I noticed something caught under the wiper blade on the windshield. A small piece of folded paper. I pulled it out and opened it. It was a page torn from an old notepad, the edges dirty and wet from the rain. In shaky handwriting, it said, "Didn't think anyone still came here." I stood there, staring at those words for a long time. The writing looked rushed, uneven. I didn't know what to make of it. Whoever had been out there hadn't tried to hurt me, but the fact that they'd known I was there, had come that close, had been watching, it was enough. I drove straight home and never went back to that cabin again. A few weeks later, I tried looking up who might own the land now, but the old county records didn't show anything clear. Some sections had changed hands, others had been left unclaimed. I didn't dig any deeper. Every now and then, I still think about those boot prints circling the cabin, the sound of those slow steps in the dark, and that single handprint on the window. It's not the kind of thing that fades away. Sometimes when I wake up at night and hear something outside my house, I remember that note, the way it looked like it had been written in a hurry, like the person had been right there watching while I slept. It's been years since then, but I still can't shake the feeling that maybe whoever it was hadn't just stumbled across that place by accident. Maybe they'd been using that cabin for a while. Maybe they still do. And maybe when I showed up, I was the one trespassing. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone in a cabin I had bought deep in the woods of northern Montana. I was 34 at the time, recently divorced and trying to clear my head. The cabin wasn't much. 2 small rooms, a sagging porch, and a roof patched with metal sheets. It sat about 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless pine trees and a long dirt road that took nearly an hour to drive through. I had fixed it up over the years whenever I had time off from work, and this trip was supposed to be quiet. I wanted peace, just me, the woods, and silence. The first few days were simple. I woke up early, made coffee on the propane stove, chopped some firewood, and fished by the lake a few miles down the hill. There was no phone signal and no electricity, just a small generator I ran in the evenings. The nights were cold, even in summer, and when the wind pushed through the trees, it made the cabin creak like something breathing in its sleep. But I got used to it. It felt like the kind of solitude I'd been needing for years. By the 4th night, I started noticing small things that didn't feel right. When I came back from the lake, I found the door slightly open. I could have sworn I'd shut it before leaving. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I hadn't latched it properly. That same night, I heard something like slow footsteps outside the window. They stopped when I stood up. I waited, holding my breath, and heard nothing after that. Probably an animal, I told myself, deer, maybe a bear. The woods had plenty of both. On the sixth day, I found fresh boot prints behind the cabin near the woodpile. They weren't mine. The soles were different, and the prints were deeper, like someone heavier had been standing there for a while. The weird thing was that they led toward the woods but didn't come from any direction I could trace. It was like someone had been standing there, then vanished. That made my stomach twist, but again, I tried to reason with it. Maybe some hunter had passed through. Maybe he was just checking the area. I didn't want to start panicking over nothing. That night, I locked the doors and windows before I went to bed. I remember lying awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling while the sound of the wind filled the room. Around midnight, I heard a dull thump outside, near the porch. Then another, slow and steady. It wasn't an animal, it was too deliberate. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed and waited. The noise stopped. I sat there, listening so hard that my ears rang. 10 minutes passed before I gathered the courage to move. When I finally did, I crept to the window and shone the light outside. The beam caught the woodpile, the porch, the path that led into the trees. Nothing. Everything looked still. But then, just as I was about to turn off the light, I noticed something at the edge of the yard. A dark shape, half behind a tree, about 30 yards away. It looked like someone standing there, facing the cabin. My hands started shaking. I blinked and looked again, but the shape was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up till dawn, checking the window every few minutes. When the light finally came, I went outside and looked around. There were new prints again. This time they circled the cabin. My throat felt dry as I followed them toward the tree line, but they disappeared about 20 feet in. The ground was covered in needles and dry leaves, so it was impossible to see where they went after that. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside as much as possible. I barely went out except to get water from the well. I kept the generator off most of the time, afraid the noise would attract whoever or whatever was out there. The silence during the day became heavier than the night. I could hear every creak, every twig snapping outside. By the second night, I was jumpy enough that I slept with a hammer beside the bed. On the 8th day, I found something that made my stomach twist worse than before. Behind the cabin, near the old tool shed, I saw a pile of freshly disturbed dirt. Someone had dug a shallow hole about the size of a person. I stood there staring at it for a long time, the air thick around me, not even sure what I was looking at. I thought maybe it was an animal digging, but when I looked closer, I saw clear shovel marks. Someone had done it by hand. The dirt was wet and dark, and there was a faint smell, like rot. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed some clothes, my flashlight, and my revolver into the truck. I was planning to leave, but when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything I could. Nothing looked wrong, but it was dead. That's when I saw the hood latch was loose. Someone had opened it. I remember just standing there with my hands shaking, feeling the full weight of the realization that I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me, maybe for days. That night was the longest night of my life. I barricaded the door with the table and stayed in the corner of the room with the hammer and my flashlight. Every sound outside made me jump. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement again. Soft, steady footsteps circling the cabin. The boards on the porch creaked. Then silence. I waited for what felt like hours before finally falling asleep out of pure exhaustion. When I woke up, it was morning. The table was still against the door. Everything inside looked the same. I forced myself to go outside again. The first thing I noticed was the dirt by the shed. The hole had been filled back in. Fresh dirt, smooth, like someone had finished what they were doing. My heart dropped into my stomach. I grabbed a shovel from the shed and started digging. The air was cold, even though the sun was out. The deeper I went, the worse the smell got. After a few minutes, the metal hit something soft. I froze. My breath turned short and sharp. I dug carefully, pushing the dirt aside until I saw it. A human hand, pale and bloated. I stepped back and dropped the shovel. My brain just stopped. Took me a while to move again. I didn't even know what to do. I felt sick, terrified, like I was caught inside some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I didn't know who the body was or how long it had been there. All I knew was that someone had been out there every night, watching me while I slept, walking around the cabin, and they'd buried a body not 30 feet from where I'd been living. I left everything behind that morning. I took only my flashlight and revolver and started walking down the dirt road toward town. It took me nearly 6 hours to get to the highway. I flagged down a passing truck, and the driver called the sheriff for me. They went out to the cabin later that day. A week later, one of the officers called to tell me what they found. The body was that of a man who had gone missing 2 years earlier. They believed he'd been killed somewhere else and buried there later. The footprints around the cabin didn't match anyone they could identify. Whoever had been there was still out there. They told me my truck had been tampered with, wires cut under the hood. I never went back to that cabin again. I sold the land a year later. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel that same cold weight in my stomach. The part that haunts me most isn't the body they found. It's the nights I spent there, sitting in the dark, while someone stood just outside, watching, waiting. And the worst part of all is knowing that whoever it was, they knew exactly when to leave. They were close enough to hear me, maybe even see me, and they're still somewhere out there, walking through those same woods, watching someone else's cabin in the dark. It was late October of 2016, and I had been working as a park ranger for just over 3 years. My station was a small wooden cabin in the northern part of Glacier Pines National Park, Montana. It wasn't one of those big ranger outposts with radio towers and full kitchens, just a single-room cabin built in the 70s, tucked deep into the tree line about 5 miles from the nearest access road. My job was mostly solitary, checking the trails, maintaining markers, and making sure campers followed fire safety rules. I didn't mind being alone. I liked the quiet, the stillness of the woods. But that week, something about the forest felt off. The first few days were uneventful. The days were getting shorter, and temperatures were dropping fast. Most of the campsites had already been closed for the season, but a few late hikers still passed through. I was supposed to stay in the cabin for 2 weeks, monitor the northern routes, and keep logs of any wildlife sightings. The cabin had the basics: a cot, a wood stove, a small desk, and an old metal filing cabinet full of previous reports. There was no signal out there, no running water either. Just me, the trees, and the radio that connected me to the main ranger station about 20 miles south. It started on the 5th night. It had been raining all day, one of those steady, cold rains that never really stop. By sunset, the whole forest was soaked, and fog began to form between the trees. I had finished logging a few notes about trail erosion and settled in for the night. Around 9 p.m., I was heating a can of chili on the stove when I heard something outside. A crunching sound, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a branch loose or maybe a deer moving through the brush. But then it stopped. Dead silence. The woods were usually alive with sound. Even at night, I could hear crickets, frogs, or the distant hoot of an owl. But not that night. It was like the entire forest had gone still. I stood by the window and looked out into the fog. My flashlight barely reached 10 feet beyond the porch. The trees looked like shadows pressed against a white sheet of mist. I waited there for a minute, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I went back to eating, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed something strange near the cabin. The ground around the porch was muddy from the rain, and in the mud were footprints, but not boots. Bare feet. They were small, maybe a man's size 8, but wide, and the tracks went around the cabin in a loose circle before disappearing into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like animal prints or worn-down boot treads. Someone had been walking barefoot in the freezing rain. I checked the area, but there were no signs of a campfire, no broken branches, no clothing or trash. I made a note of it in my report, telling myself it could have been some lost hiker or a camper who got caught in the storm. But deep down, it didn't sit right with me. Nobody should have been that far north without a permit. The following night, the wind picked up. The fog came back thicker than before, and I could barely see the outline of the trees beyond the porch. Around 11, I was lying on my cot, reading a few old logs from the cabinet. Some of the entries dated back to the 80s. A few rangers had mentioned hearing odd noises around the same area. One report mentioned a vagrant spotted wandering the trails barefoot near Frost Hollow Creek, which was less than a mile from my cabin. I remember thinking it was weird, but maybe it was just coincidence. At around midnight, I heard it again, the same slow crunching sound. This time it was closer. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight. The sound moved from behind the cabin toward the side window. The beam from my light hit nothing but fog and raindrops. Then came a faint scratching sound against the wall, like fingernails dragging across wood. My stomach tightened. I didn't move. The scratching stopped after maybe 10 seconds, replaced by silence again. I didn't sleep that night. When daylight came, I stepped outside carefully, scanning the tree line. The footprints were back, this time leading up to the wall near the window. The mud had preserved them perfectly. Again, barefoot. Whoever it was had stood right there, just inches away from the window where I had been sitting. The thought of someone silently watching me through that fog chilled me to my core. I decided to check the nearby trails that morning. I hiked toward Frost Hollow Creek, following the muddy slope down to where the water ran. The forest was quiet again, except for the sound of dripping leaves and the slow flow of the creek. That's when I noticed something else. Scraps of old clothing caught in the brush. A torn shirt sleeve, stained dark brown. The fabric looked weathered, like it had been out there for months, maybe years. I collected the piece and stuffed it in my pack, planning to log it later. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was already getting dark. The air felt heavy, colder than usual. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it, which I'd never done before. I kept my flashlight on the desk beside me while I wrote my report for the day. My handwriting was shaky. I didn't write much, just enough to note what I saw, the prints, and the clothing by the creek. I kept telling myself it was just some drifter, maybe someone living off-grid. People did that sometimes, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that whoever it was, they were still out there watching. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate. I could tell by the way the boards creaked on the porch. The sound stopped right at the door. Then there was a faint rattle of the doorknob. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might shake the bed frame. The knob moved again, just slightly, like someone testing it. Then nothing, just the sound of wind pushing against the roof. I didn't move until sunrise. When the sun came up, I stepped outside again. The footprints were fresh, clear as day, leading from the woods to the door and then back out toward the trees. I followed them this time, carefully, with my hand on my sidearm. They weaved through the brush for about 100 feet before stopping abruptly near a fallen log. No sign of anyone, no camps, nothing. Just prints ending in the middle of the woods. That was the last night I spent in that cabin. When I finally radioed the main station later that morning, I told them I was cutting my stay short. I packed my things, locked the cabin, and started the hike back toward the service road. The forest was quiet again, calm even, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched the entire way out. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the fog. When I got back to base, I handed in my report and the torn fabric I found. A few weeks later, one of the senior rangers mentioned that years ago, a man had gone missing near Frost Hollow Creek. No trace of him was ever found, except his shoes, which were discovered about a mile from where my cabin stood. I never went back to that post again. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights, the silence, the prints, the faint scratching on the wall. Sometimes I wonder if that person was lost, looking for help, or something worse. But what bothers me most isn't what I saw. It's what I didn't see. Whoever they were, they knew how to move quietly, how to circle the cabin without being spotted. They wanted me to know they were there. And that kind of intent, the kind that waits and watches, is worse than any creature or ghost story you'll ever hear. To this day, I still check the ground when I step outside at night. Old habit, I guess. But sometimes, when it rains and the mud is fresh, I swear I see the faint outline of a footprint, small, bare, and facing my door. It was late October of 2013 when I decided to take a week off and drive up to a small cabin I'd rented in northern Montana. I'd been working construction for years, and my body was worn out. The noise of the city, the constant hammering, and the endless days had built up inside me like pressure in a pipe. I needed silence, something that didn't involve traffic, bosses, or ringing phones. The cabin was cheap, small, and far enough from any town that it seemed perfect. I left my truck packed with supplies, some food, a jerry can of gas, my old .22 rifle, and a few tools just in case. The drive took nearly 12 hours, most of it through long stretches of empty road surrounded by forest and low hills. By the time I reached Miller Ridge, the sky was already darkening, the horizon stained with a reddish tint from the sunset. The road to the cabin wasn't much of a road, just a dirt path with deep ruts, half covered in fallen leaves and mud. The tires slipped a few times, but eventually, I reached it. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing, facing a thick wall of pine trees. It looked older than the pictures online. The roof sagged slightly, the wood was gray and weathered, and the porch had a few missing boards. But it was quiet, just the kind of quiet I wanted. I unloaded my gear, lit the kerosene lamps, and started a small fire in the wood stove. The air inside smelled faintly of mold and old smoke. There was one small bedroom, a kitchen area with a hand pump, and a back door that led into the trees. That first night was uneventful. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, and I could hear branches creaking outside. I remember lying in the bed, staring at the ceiling beams, thinking how peaceful it felt to be alone. The next morning, I walked around the area, checking the woods and a small stream nearby. The air was cold and sharp, and every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, seemed louder out there. I noticed tire tracks in the dirt road that didn't belong to my truck. They looked fresh. 2 sets, one of a pickup, another maybe of an ATV. I didn't think much of it. Hunters used these woods often. By the second night, I'd started feeling a bit uneasy. It wasn't the isolation, I liked that. But there was something about the woods. They were too still. Even when the wind moved, there were no birds, no crickets, nothing. Just the sound of the trees shifting. Late that night, around midnight, I heard something outside. Not an animal. It was a dull thud, like someone had dropped a heavy object onto the porch. I froze on the bed and just listened. Then I heard a faint scrape along the wall, slow and dragging. I reached for my flashlight and the rifle and sat there for a long time just listening. The sound stopped after a while and I didn't go out to check. I told myself it was a raccoon or a branch falling. When morning came, I went outside to look. There were footprints in the mud, bare footprints. Not animal, not boots. Human. I could see the heel and toe marks clearly leading up to the porch steps, stopping near the door, and then heading back toward the tree line. The mud was half dried, so it must have happened late in the night. My stomach sank, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was hiking, maybe drunk, maybe a prank, but barefoot, out here in the cold? I spent the day stacking some firewood and keeping myself busy, but I kept checking the tree line. Felt like someone was there watching. That evening, I locked the doors and windows, even nailed a few boards over the back door. I cooked some beans on the stove and sat near the fire, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut. Around 10 p.m., I heard the same dull sound again, this time farther from the porch, near the side of the cabin. Then another sound, lighter, almost like breathing near the window. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. After a few minutes, I heard something brush against the window, just a soft, quick touch. I waited, rifle in hand, barely breathing. Then silence again, that kind of silence that doesn't feel natural. It took hours before I fell asleep, sitting up against the wall. The next day I found more footprints, this time circling the cabin. They looked like the same ones, but deeper, as if the person had stood there longer. I walked around with the rifle for nearly an hour, checking the woods, but there was no sign of anyone. No trail, no movement. I started to think maybe it was someone living out there, some drifter or hermit. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, it got worse. I woke up suddenly, hearing something metallic, like the clink of the latch on the front door. My heart started pounding. I could see faint light from the dying fire flickering across the walls. Then a shadow moved across the window, slow and steady. I held the rifle tight and stayed quiet. I could hear breathing again, closer this time, right on the other side of the door. The handle rattled gently. Whoever it was didn't try to break in. They just stood there for a while, then walked away. I could hear soft steps moving around the cabin, then fading off into the woods. When morning came, I packed my things fast. I was ready to leave, but when I walked out to my truck, my stomach dropped again. The gas can was gone, and there were fingerprints on the driver's side window, muddy, smeared. I opened the door and checked inside. Everything else was there, but the back tires looked low, like someone had let air out of them. I decided to drive out anyway. The truck bounced and struggled through the muddy road, but I managed to get to the main highway after about an hour. I didn't stop until I reached a small diner near Kalispell. I sat there for a long time, drinking coffee, thinking about what happened. Out of curiosity, or maybe stupidity, I called the number for the cabin owner that was listed online and told them I'd left early. They mentioned something that made my skin crawl. The place had been broken into a few months before. The sheriff had found signs that someone had been living in the woods nearby. An old campsite, animal bones, empty food cans, and a pile of clothes that didn't look recent. They thought it was some survivalist or maybe a homeless man hiding out there. They never caught him. I didn't say much else. I just hung up and sat in the truck for a long time before driving home. Even now, years later, I still remember those footprints and the sound outside that cabin. It wasn't fear of ghosts or anything like that. It was fear of something real. Person. Someone who had been out there in the cold, barefoot, circling my cabin, watching me sleep through those thin wooden walls. And sometimes when I wake up at night, I still hear that same faint sound. the scrape of something against wood, and I wonder if he ever really stayed behind, or if he just found someone else's cabin farther down the ridge. It was early November 2004. The air in northern Montana had started to carry that sharp cold that cut through your clothes, the kind that made your hands ache when you tried to grip something for too long. I'd been with the county sheriff's department for 9 years by then, and I was used to strange calls. Suicides, lost hikers, poachers, even a few meth labs out in the woods. But that one call, about an abandoned cabin up near White Pine Ridge, still sticks to me like a stain I can't wash out. I was the only deputy on duty that night. The call came in just after 6 p.m. from a retired logger who said he'd seen a pickup truck parked off a service road near the ridge for 3 days straight. No movement, no lights. It wasn't unusual for hunters to leave vehicles around there, but 3 days was pushing it, especially in November. The ridge was miles from any main road, and with the weather turning, anyone out there too long could freeze overnight. I took the department SUV and my K9, Duke, a German Shepherd I'd been partnered with for 4 years. We drove west from town, passing the mills and the long stretches of empty road where the pine trees leaned over like walls. The sun was already fading when I turned onto the service road. It was narrow, muddy in places, and covered in layers of brown needles. Duke sat in the passenger seat, his eyes following the shadows that slipped past the windshield. Took about 30 minutes to reach the truck. A rusted green Ford F-150, maybe from the late 80s, half sunk into the mud, branches brushing against its sides. There were old tire tracks around it, but no fresh ones. I checked the plate. It was registered to a man named Mark Ellison from Kalispell. I didn't recognize the name. The door was locked, but the window was cracked just enough that I could see inside with my flashlight. A sleeping bag was rolled up on the seat, a pair of boots on the floorboard, and an empty thermos tipped over. No blood, no sign of struggle. The odd part was the smell. Even with the windows mostly shut, I caught that faint sour stench that always sets off alarms in your head when you've been doing this job long enough. I called it in, told dispatch I was checking out the area before towing the vehicle. Then I grabbed my jacket, my flashlight, and Duke's leash, and started following what looked like boot prints leading up a narrow trail behind the truck. The trail wound uphill, through thick pine and wet brush, slick with melting frost. The prints looked a few days old. The man had been carrying something heavy. One set of deep, uneven tracks, as if he'd been dragging or hauling weight. Duke kept his nose to the ground, moving ahead of me, his tail stiff. We went about half a mile before I saw it. The cabin. It was small, probably built back in the 60s or 70s. Hand-cut logs, tin roof with holes, half-collapsed porch. The windows were covered from the inside, maybe with blankets or tarps. I didn't see any smoke from a chimney, no signs of life. The door was shut but not locked. When I stepped up to it, Duke started growling low in his throat. That was the first real moment I felt uneasy. He wasn't the type to react without reason. I pushed the door open and the smell hit me harder than before. Rot. That thick, sweet, sickening smell of decomposition. I'd smelled it too many times to mistake it. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and went inside. The cabin was one room, a cot in one corner, a small wood stove, a table with old coffee cans and cigarette butts scattered across it. A lantern hung from a nail on the wall. The floor was covered in dirt and pine needles, and there were muddy boot prints leading toward the back. That's where I found him. A man lying face down near the back wall, one arm stretched out under a chair, the other tucked close to his chest. His body was stiff and bloated. Judging by the state of him, he'd been dead for at least 3 or 4 days. The smell had already soaked into the air, into the walls. I crouched down, careful not to touch him, and used my flashlight to look around. There was a shotgun near his hand, the barrel pointing toward the floor. The safety was off. On the table beside the cot, I noticed a folded piece of paper weighed down with an empty whiskey bottle. Before checking it, I scanned the rest of the room. There were cans of food, a sleeping bag, and a small duffel bag half unzipped with clothes spilling out. The man had been living here, at least temporarily. I checked his pockets for ID. His wallet was there. Mark Ellison, the same name from the truck. I stood back up, letting out a slow breath. At first glance, it looked like a suicide. The way the gun was placed, the isolation, the bottle, everything fit the pattern. But something didn't feel right. His position was awkward. If he'd shot himself, the gun should have been closer to his head, not several feet away. And there wasn't much blood. Not enough for a close-range shot. I radioed dispatch again, told them I'd found a body, needed a coroner and backup. The signal out here was weak, cutting in and out, but I managed to get through. Then I went back to the table and unfolded the paper. It wasn't a note, just a rough hand-drawn map. Lines marking forest roads, circles around certain areas, and a few numbers scribbled next to them. Maybe hunting spots, maybe something else. Couldn't tell. That's when I noticed something else. A faint mark on the floorboards leading from the cot to the back wall. It looked like something had been dragged. I followed it with my light, and sure enough, there was a loose board near the wall. I pried it up with my knife. Underneath was a small dugout space, maybe 2 feet deep. Inside were several plastic bags wrapped tight with tape. I cut one open just enough to peek inside, and what I saw made my stomach twist. Cash. Dozens of small stacks of it, old bills, hundreds and 20s mostly. I counted roughly, there had to be tens of thousands of dollars there. My first thought was drugs. Maybe stolen money, maybe something tied to one of the cases from a few years back. But then I noticed something else. Small, rust-colored stains on the edges of one of the bags. Blood. I was standing there processing it all when Duke barked sharply at the window. His fur was standing up along his back. I stepped over to look. Through the cracks in the boarded-up glass, I saw movement in the trees outside. A figure too far to make out details, but tall, wearing dark clothes. He moved quick, slipping behind a tree and disappearing uphill. I didn't chase. The smart part of me knew better than to run blind through the woods at dusk with no backup. I shut the door, checked that it latched, and waited. My radio was crackling again. Dispatch trying to reach me, asking for my position. By the time backup arrived, it was full dark. 3 deputies, the coroner, and a state investigator showed up. I walked them through everything, the body, the hidden money, the tracks, the figure I saw. We searched the area for hours, found nothing but old boot prints leading deeper into the woods before vanishing near a stream. The autopsy later confirmed what I already suspected. Mark Ellison hadn't killed himself. He'd been shot in the back of the head, execution style. The shotgun was staged. The money was linked to a string of robberies across 2 states. Ellison had likely been hiding out, waiting for someone, or running from them. They never found the man I saw in the trees that night. Not one trace. For weeks after, I kept thinking about that cabin, about how close I'd been to whoever had done it, how long they might have been watching from the woods while I stood over that body. Every time I replayed it, I realized I could have been next if I'd gone outside. The cabin was torn down the following spring after the investigation ended. But sometimes, when I drive through that part of the county, I still think about it. How quiet it was. How Duke growled before I even opened the door. They said it was just one more unsolved case in a long list. But to me, it was a reminder. Out there in the woods, far from the town lights, people do things they never want anyone to find out about. And sometimes you find them too late. I never went back to that ridge again. Not once. The memory of that smell, that silence, and that shadow in the trees, that was enough. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a short break from work and drive out to the countryside in northern Montana. I was 31 at the time, worn down from a long stretch of night shifts at the factory. A friend of mine had told me about a small rental cabin tucked deep in the woods near a river, quiet and completely isolated. It sounded perfect. I wanted silence, no phone calls, no neighbors, no noise, just a few days to clear my head. I left early in the morning, the back of my old Ford loaded with basic supplies. A small cooler, a duffel bag, a folding chair, a flashlight, a camping knife, and a few cans of food. The drive took about 6 hours, most of it through long, empty roads lined with pines and patches of fog that hung low across the ground. The further I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No houses, no gas stations, just the occasional rusty mailbox or a torn sign pointing down a dirt path. By the time I reached the cabin, it was close to evening. The sky had turned a dull gray, and the temperature had dropped fast. The place looked older than the pictures online. Darker wood, chipped paint on the porch rails, and a faint sag in the roof. The cabin sat about half a mile from the river, surrounded by tall, uneven trees that creaked in the wind. There was a small gravel clearing where I parked, and the rest was forest. The silence was heavy. No cars, no voices, not even birds at that moment. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and cold air. There were only 2 rooms, a main space with a table, a stove, a small couch, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bathroom that looked like it hadn't been used much. The windows were dusty but not broken, and the floorboards made a hollow sound when I walked. It wasn't fancy, but it felt private, and that was all I wanted. That first night, I unpacked my things and lit a few candles since the power kept flickering. The wind outside had picked up, scraping branches across the roof. I ate a can of beans cold, drank a beer, and sat on the small porch for a while, listening to the woods. After a while, the sound of the wind became steady and dull. I remember thinking it felt good to be away from everything. But later, when I was about to go to bed, I heard something strange outside. It wasn't an animal noise. It was softer and slower, like the sound of someone stepping on gravel 1 foot at a time. I froze and listened. It stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a branch falling. I didn't have curtains on the windows, so the dark outside felt like it was pressing right against the glass. I lay down, kept the flashlight beside me, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning was cold and quiet again. I went outside, walked down to the river, and followed a trail for a bit. The water was low and moved slow over the rocks. I didn't see anyone, no other cabins, no footprints besides mine. The air smelled damp and earthy. When I got back to the cabin, though, I noticed something off. On the gravel near my truck, there were boot prints. Not mine. They were bigger and went around the back of the cabin, then disappeared toward the tree line. I crouched to look closer. The prints were clear. The ground was still wet from last night's rain. Someone had walked there recently. I felt a small jolt of unease but tried to shake it off. Maybe someone had come by to check the place, maybe a forest worker or a hunter. Still, the idea of someone walking around my cabin while I slept didn't sit right. I checked the door and windows, all locked. Nothing seemed moved inside. That night, I made sure to lock everything again and pushed a chair under the doorknob, just to be sure. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint thump sound. It wasn't loud, just a single dull hit, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I waited, holding my breath, and after a while, it happened again. This time a little sharper, then silence. I lay there for almost an hour, staring at the ceiling, every sound from the woods outside feeling too close. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. There was a small dent on the outer wall near one of the windows, like someone had pressed something metal against it. It wasn't big, but it hadn't been there before. I didn't find footprints this time, just disturbed dirt near the trees. I started to feel uneasy about being there. My plan had been to stay 3 nights, but that morning I decided I might leave early if I felt off again. Later that afternoon, I noticed something else. Near the edge of the clearing, where the woods began, there was a broken beer bottle and a small pile of ashes, like from a campfire. Someone had been sitting there recently. The ashes were fresh, and the glass was wet like it had rained overnight. That meant whoever was there had been close enough to watch the cabin without me knowing. By evening, the wind came back strong. I sat inside with the flashlight and my pocket knife near me. The power went out completely this time. The darkness filled every corner of the room, and I could hear the wind howling through the trees outside. At some point, I heard that sound again. Slow, deliberate steps in the gravel, moving around the side of the cabin. Then nothing. Then a faint creak from the porch boards. I sat still, barely breathing. I didn't move or make a sound. The air inside felt thick, and my heartbeat was all I could hear. After a few minutes, I heard something slide gently along the outer wall, like fingers dragging across wood. It circled the cabin once, slow and steady. I stayed there for hours until I finally saw faint light through the window dawn. When I opened the door in the morning, my stomach sank. There were fresh footprints again, right up to the porch. They stopped near the steps and turned back toward the woods. But near the window beside my bed, there was a smudge mark, like a handprint, greasy and streaked across the glass. Someone had been right there, standing inches away from where I slept. I packed up everything fast. I didn't care about the food I left behind. I threw my bag into the truck, started the engine, and drove out as fast as I could down that dirt road. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees packed close, and the air still cold. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I hit the main road again. When I got back to town, I called the owner of the cabin to tell him what happened. He didn't seem too surprised. He said there had been reports of squatters in the area sometimes, people living off the grid, using empty cabins when no one was around. He said it was probably nothing to worry about, but I knew better. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They had been watching, waiting, and close enough to touch the window while I slept. That night, back home in my apartment, I kept thinking about that smudge on the glass, that oily handprint. The thought of someone standing outside, staring in, knowing I was right there but doing nothing, not breaking in, not saying anything, just watching. That was what stayed with me. Not the noise, not the footprints, just that quiet waiting. I never went back to that cabin. The owner sent me a refund for the unused nights, but I didn't care. Months later, I read an article about a missing hunter not far from that same area. Found deep in the woods, his campsite destroyed, and no one ever caught who did it. It made my stomach twist. I sometimes still think about those nights, the steps, the marks, the silence after every sound. And every time I close my eyes in the dark, I still picture that single greasy handprint on the window, left there by someone who knew I was inside, completely alone. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take a short trip up north, just outside of a small town called Rockford in Michigan. I had been working non-stop for months, sitting behind a computer screen every day, barely sleeping, barely going outside. My head was a mess, and I thought maybe some quiet time in a cabin surrounded by nothing but trees and cold air might help clear my thoughts. I had found this small, cheap cabin online. It was old, worn out, but it looked peaceful. It was about half a mile off an unpaved forest road, and the ad said there was no electricity, just a wood stove, a gas lantern, and an outdoor pump for water. That didn't bother me. In fact, it felt like exactly what I needed. I packed up my old Ford Ranger with some canned food, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, a flashlight, a small axe, and my dog Milo. He was a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix, quiet but always alert. He'd been my companion through a lot of lonely nights, and I figured having him there would make me feel safer. We left early in the morning, the roads empty and the air chilly but calm. The farther I drove, the quieter everything got. After about 3 hours, the paved road ended and turned into a dirt trail that was mostly covered in fallen leaves. I followed it carefully until I saw the small wooden sign nailed to a tree with faded letters that said, Cedar Hollow. The cabin sat at the end of that path, half hidden behind tall pine trees, surrounded by thick brush and dead leaves. The place looked older than it did in the photos. The wood was dark and dry, the roof sagged slightly on one side, and the small porch had nails sticking up. There was an old metal chair out front that looked like it hadn't been sat on in years. Still, there was something peaceful about it. No phone service, no noise, no people. Just the cold, quiet woods and the sound of wind passing through the branches. Inside, the cabin was simple. One small room with a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with old pots and pans, and a stove in the corner. The floor creaked with every step. There was a small window next to the bed, its glass foggy and scratched. I put my bag down, unpacked the food, and set up a small area for Milo near the door. The first day went fine. I gathered some wood, started a small fire in the stove, and cooked a can of soup. The smell of the burning wood mixed with the damp air inside made it oddly comforting. I took Milo for a short walk around the area before the sun started going down. The trees seemed to swallow the light faster than normal out there. By the time it was 6:30, it already felt like night. The silence was heavy. Even Milo seemed to notice it. He would perk up his ears now and then and stare into the trees, but there was nothing. No birds, no rustling, nothing but wind. I tried to brush it off and went to bed early. That night, though, I woke up sometime around midnight. Milo was standing near the door, stiff and focused. I could hear something faint outside, like slow, heavy crunches of footsteps on dry leaves. They weren't consistent, like someone was walking, stopping, then walking again. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to listen through the sound of my heartbeat. The footsteps moved around the cabin slowly, circling it once, then stopped near the back wall. I didn't move. Milo didn't bark. He just stayed frozen, growling low but quiet. After about a minute, everything went silent again. I waited a long time before I could even close my eyes again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The ground was damp from the night before, and sure enough, there were marks. Shoe prints, not animal tracks. The prints were faint but visible, and they led from the woods to the back of the cabin, then off toward the trees again. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't seen a single car or person on my way up there, and the cabin was too far from the main road for anyone to just wander by. I tried not to think too much of it, telling myself maybe a hiker got lost and passed by. Still, the thought stuck in my head all day. I noticed Milo kept sniffing around near the edge of the tree line, ears back, tail low. He'd stand still and stare for a while, then come back to me. By the third night, I was uneasy. The quiet that had felt peaceful at first now felt wrong. Around 9 p.m., while I was sitting near the stove, I heard something again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. Came from near the back again. Just one sharp noise, then nothing. Milo jumped up immediately, hackles raised. He went straight to the door, pacing, staring out through the window slit. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, but the weak beam barely cut through the darkness. I waited, hoping to hear something else, but it stayed quiet. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every small sound made me tense up. I kept the flashlight in my hand until morning. The next day, I decided to take a walk farther down the trail, see if there were any signs of people nearby. I went about half a mile out, and that's when I noticed something strange. A small fire pit made of stones, still blackened with ash. It looked like it hadn't been used in days, maybe a week. Around it were a few old cans, a torn sleeping bag, and a piece of blue tarp tangled in a bush. It looked like someone had been camping there not too long ago. I felt uneasy again. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone in those woods. Around 11 p.m., just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time faster, crunching leaves near the front porch. Milo started growling low, standing rigid near the door. I sat up, listening hard. The steps came closer until I could hear them right outside the door. I could even hear the faint sound of breathing, slow, uneven. I didn't move. I held my breath. Milo stood like a statue, head low, ready. The footsteps moved toward the window beside the bed. I could hear the faint creak of the porch boards. Then a light scraping sound, like a hand or something sliding across the glass. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. After a few long seconds, it stopped. I stayed awake till sunrise, barely breathing, gripping my flashlight and the small axe I kept near my bag. When morning came, I finally went outside. There were muddy boot prints on the porch, fresh ones, still wet from dew. They led right up to the window and back toward the woods. I followed them a few yards until they disappeared into the thick brush. That was enough for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. The whole time, I felt like something was watching me from the tree line. Milo stayed close, tail low, ears back. When I finally started the truck and turned down that narrow dirt road, I didn't look back once. I stopped at the nearest gas station about 20 minutes away, went inside, and told the clerk someone might have been staying near the woods by Cedar Hollow. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said people sometimes squat out there, old hunters, drifters, sometimes people who don't want to be found. He said a few cabins had been broken into over the years. That night, when I finally got back home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how quiet those footsteps were, how close they had come, and how still they'd been outside that window. It's been years since that trip, but sometimes when I take Milo for a walk at night, he'll stop suddenly, ears up, staring into the dark like he did back then. And every time he does, I get that same cold feeling in my chest, remembering the sound of those slow, heavy steps circling that cabin in the woods. I never went back to Rockford after that. The cabin's still listed online. I checked once out of curiosity. But now the photos look even older, the wood darker, the grass taller. No one's been there for a long time. And sometimes I wonder if whoever was watching me back then is still out there, wandering through those same woods, waiting for the next person to rent that place and spend a night alone. It was late October 2012. I was 28 at the time, tired of city life and the constant noise that came with it. I'd taken a few weeks off work to get away, just me and my dog, Rocco. I had this idea of building a small cabin on a piece of land I had recently bought in the mountains of western Montana. It wasn't much, just a few acres of wooded hills, an old logging trail, and a creek that ran along the bottom edge. The plan was to build something simple, something small that I could use for weekends or hunting trips. I didn't have much experience building, but I figured I could manage enough to make it livable. The weather had been rough the whole week. It rained almost every day, steady and cold, with the kind of gray skies that made the afternoons feel like dusk. But I kept working through it. I had a small tent pitched under a cluster of pines near the site and a tarp stretched between two trees to keep most of the rain off my supplies. By the time Friday came, I had most of the frame up. It was crude, but it stood, and that was enough to keep me going. That night, though, something felt different. The air was heavy and thick, like the clouds were pressing down on the earth. I remember how quiet it was right before the rain started again. No wind, no birds, no sound except the distant roll of thunder far off in the mountains. Rocco was lying near the fire pit I had built from flat rocks, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching every now and then. I was sitting on an overturned bucket, looking at the half-built cabin. The frame looked like a skeleton against the dark tree line, wetwood shining under the dim light of my lantern. When the rain began, it wasn't just a drizzle. It came down hard, slanting sideways with gusts of wind that sent water dripping from the pine branches like tiny rivers. The fire hissed and went out, leaving only the lantern glow. I moved everything under the tarp and sat there, listening to the sound of the rain hammering the tent. Rocco got up and came closer, sitting right beside me. I could tell he was uneasy. He kept looking toward the dark woods beyond the clearing. The strange thing was, I couldn't hear anything except the rain. Usually, even in storms, I'd hear the creek rushing below or the wind moving through the trees. But that night, it felt like the world had gone completely still, like everything was holding its breath. Around 10, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into the tent with Rocco, zipped it shut, and lay on my sleeping bag listening to the constant drumming of rain. It must have been around midnight when I woke up. Rocco wasn't lying down anymore. He was standing near the tent flap, his body stiff, ears straight up, and his nose pointed toward the entrance. I could hear him breathing heavy through his nose. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or something moving close by, but the rain was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Then I caught a faint sound that didn't fit. It wasn't thunder or rain. It was like a slow crunching of footsteps on wet ground. Not the quick scamper of an animal, but heavy, dragging steps. I sat up quietly and reached for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I just waited, listening. The steps stopped, and then there was only rain again. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I turned the light on and pointed it at the tent flap, half expecting to see a shadow move across it, but nothing happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was standing just out of the light, watching. I unzipped the tent halfway and looked out. The rain was still pouring, bouncing off the mud. The lantern under the tarp was flickering weakly, almost out of fuel. The cabin frame loomed in the dark like a broken outline. I scanned the treeline with the light, moving slowly. Nothing, just rain hitting leaves and puddles. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe an elk wandering through. Still, I didn't go back to sleep. Rocco wouldn't settle down either. He sat there for nearly an hour, just staring at the tent wall, ears twitching. When morning finally came, everything was soaked. My tools, my tarp, even the firewood I had stored under the cover, all wet. The ground was thick with mud, and the creek had risen several feet overnight. I was exhausted from barely sleeping, but I went back to work anyway, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. It wasn't until I started walking toward the edge of the clearing that I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but they were too deep and the pattern was off. These were larger, wider, and spaced unevenly, like whoever made them had a limp or was dragging one leg. They started near the creek and came straight toward my tent before stopping just a few feet from where I'd slept. There were no prints leading away, just a muddy mess where they ended. The more I looked at them, the more wrong they seemed. They weren't fresh, but they weren't washed away either. It was like the rain hadn't touched them much, even though everything else around was soaked and flattened. I stood there for a while, just staring at them, trying to figure it out. My stomach felt tight, like a knot I couldn't untie. The day dragged on. I tried to focus on building, but I kept glancing at the woods. Every noise, every snap of a branch or rustle of wet leaves, made me freeze. Rocco wouldn't wander far that day either. He stuck close to me, and every now and then he'd stop, lift his head, and sniff the air like he caught a scent he didn't like. By late afternoon, the rain came back harder than before. The wind was cutting through the trees, making them creak and sway. I gave up on working and sat under the tarp again. I remember staring at the half-built cabin, the way the wet wood darkened, the puddles forming in the dirt, and how the light faded faster than it should have. It felt like the day didn't want to end naturally. It just turned into night, heavy and sudden. That night, I didn't bother with the tent. I took my sleeping bag and gear inside the unfinished cabin, just to have some solid walls around me. The roof wasn't complete yet, but I had enough boards across to keep most of the rain out. I lit the lantern, set it on a crate, and sat against one of the walls while Rocco lay next to me. The sound of the rain hitting the roof mixed with the wind and the creaking wood. Sometime past midnight, I heard something again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was the sound of wood breaking, a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing. I sat still, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Something was moving near the cabin frame, stepping on fallen branches or maybe hitting part of the wall. Rocco growled low, deep in his chest, the kind of sound he only made when he felt real danger. I reached for the hatchet I kept beside me. My hands were shaking, not from the cold but from whatever was building up inside me. The noises stopped for a few minutes, and then there was this dragging sound again, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I could hear the mud squishing under each step. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the handle tight, staring at the lantern light flickering across the wooden floor. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Everything went silent again except the rain. I stayed awake until morning, waiting, listening, never hearing anything else. When daylight came, I stepped outside, heart pounding, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. No broken branches, no tracks, no sign of anyone or anything. I packed up that morning. I didn't finish the cabin. I left everything, tools, supplies, wood, just as it was. I didn't even take the trail back. I cut through the trees, straight to the dirt road a mile away, with Rocco right on my heels. I didn't stop until I got back to my truck. A few weeks later, I came back in daylight, thinking maybe I'd imagined most of it. The cabin frame was still there, but half of it had collapsed from the wind and rain. The strange thing was, right beside the spot where I had camped, there were those same footprints again, half filled with rainwater, pressed deep into the mud as if someone, or something, had been there after I left. That was the last time I ever went back to that land. I sold it the next year. Sometimes, when it rains hard at night, I still think about that cabin, sitting half-rotted in the woods, and those footprints that didn't wash away. I don't know who or what made them, but I know one thing for sure. There was something out there that night, something human enough to walk but wrong enough to stay hidden. And I'll never forget the sound of it circling me in the dark. It was late September of 2018 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone at an old cabin I'd inherited from my uncle. It was tucked deep in the northern woods of Montana, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The place had been sitting unused for years, and I wanted some time away from everything. Away from my job, my phone, and people in general. The cabin wasn't much. A single-story wooden structure with a metal roof, a creaky porch, and a small shed out back. The air out there always had this cold, dry smell, like pine and dirt mixed with something older, something that felt like it had been there long before me. I drove up in my old Ford truck, packed with enough food, water, and supplies for a couple of weeks. The drive itself was rough. The road eventually turned into a narrow dirt trail, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The light went from gold to gray in a matter of minutes, and the forest got quiet. I remember standing outside after unloading my stuff, hearing nothing except the occasional wind through the trees. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was peaceful at first, but also heavy. The first night went by without much happening. I lit the fireplace, cooked some canned soup, and sat on the couch listening to the wood crackle. I kept the lantern on until late because the darkness out there felt thicker than usual, like the trees pressed against the windows. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch with my dog, Max, lying at my feet. The next morning, I noticed something odd. Around the edge of the clearing near the tree line, the ground looked disturbed, like someone had walked around in the mud. I assumed it was an animal, maybe a deer or coyote, since we were deep in the woods. The prints were hard to read, though. They were narrow, long, and uneven, not like any paw print I'd seen. I brushed it off and went about my day, splitting firewood and checking the roof for leaks. By the third night, things started to feel off. I was sitting by the window after dinner, staring out at the trees. The forest looked endless, black and motionless. Max was lying near the door, quiet and alert. Out of nowhere, he lifted his head and let out a low growl. I looked where he was staring but saw nothing. The clearing was empty. I turned off the lantern, hoping to adjust my eyes to the dark. That's when I noticed something near the edge of the trees. A shape, faint, barely moving. It looked like a person standing there, but too still. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a fallen branch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching. The next morning, I went out to check. There were footprints in the dirt again, leading closer to the cabin this time. The shape of them was strange. Long, thin, and spread unevenly like whoever made them didn't know how to walk right. They went around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. That whole day, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I made sure every window was locked, every door secured. I even nailed a few boards across the back door that led to the porch. That night, it started raining hard. The sound of it hitting the metal roof was loud enough to drown out most other noise, which I didn't like. I kept the fireplace going and tried reading, but my mind kept wandering back to those footprints. Around midnight, Max started pacing. His nails clicked against the floorboards, and he kept sniffing at the door. I told myself it was just the rain making him nervous. But then, in one of the flashes of lightning, I saw it again. A figure standing just beyond the clearing, tall and thin. The way it stood didn't look right. Its shoulders were uneven, its head tilted too far to one side, and I swear it looked like its limbs were too long. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever, watching it through the window. It didn't move, not an inch, just stood there facing the cabin. I turned away for a moment to grab my flashlight, and when I looked back, it was gone. The next day, I found more prints circling the cabin, this time closer to the windows. The rain had softened the ground, and I could see where it had knelt near the wall, pressing its hands, or what looked like hands, into the mud. The fingers were long, too long. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to leave, but my truck's rear tire was flat, probably from one of the sharp rocks along the dirt road. I tried to fix it, but I didn't have the right wrench. I was stuck there at least for another day. That night was the worst. The rain had stopped, and the air was cold and still. I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside, slow, dragging footsteps moving across the porch. Max went stiff and started growling again, his fur standing up. The sound moved around the cabin, circling it slowly. Then it stopped. I could hear it breathing soft, uneven breaths just outside the wall. I didn't move. I sat there with the shotgun my uncle had left behind, waiting. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. When the sun came up, I stepped outside to check. The porch boards had muddy prints on them, not boot prints, not animal prints. They were shaped like bare feet, but stretched like the toes were too long. I followed them down the steps, and they trailed off into the forest again. By the 5th day, I was barely eating. I kept all the curtains closed and stayed near the fireplace. I kept hearing sounds in the distance, snapping branches, low moans, something moving through the brush. Every time I looked, there was nothing. On the sixth night, I decided to stay up until morning, sitting by the window with my shotgun and flashlight. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Around 3 in the morning, Max started whining, low and nervous. I shined the flashlight through the glass, and there it was, standing near the edge of the trees again. Only this time it was closer, much closer. The light hit its face for just a second, and what I saw didn't look right. Its skin looked loose, hanging in places like it didn't fit the body it was on. The eyes reflected the light, but not like an animal's. They were dull, flat, almost human but wrong. I pulled the curtain shut and sat there, breathing hard. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I packed up everything I could carry and decided to walk out to the main road, leaving most of my supplies behind. It took hours to reach the dirt road, and when I finally got there, I looked back one last time. In the distance, near the tree line, I saw something pale move between the trunks. It wasn't walking right, more like crawling upright, jerky and off balance. I turned away and didn't stop until I reached town. A few days later, I went back with a friend and the sheriff to retrieve my truck. The cabin looked the same except for the smell, like old meat and damp wood. The prints were still there, faint in the dirt. They led from the edge of the forest right up to the cabin door. I never went back after that. Sold the property a few months later to a couple from Idaho who wanted to turn it into a hunting cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that thing standing in the dark, the way it watched me without moving, the way it breathed just outside the wall. People call things like that legends, stories told around fires to scare each other. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't some fairy tale monster. It was something real, something that shouldn't exist but does. And whatever it was, it knew I was there, and it wanted me to know it too. It was early October of 2014 when I decided to drive out to the countryside in northern Maine. I had taken a week off from work, mostly because I needed to clear my head. Things hadn't been going well back home. I had just ended a 6-year relationship, and everything about my apartment reminded me of her. I didn't really plan much. I just packed a bag, filled up my truck, and started driving north until I reached the kind of places where the road signs had bullet holes and the trees grew so thick on both sides that daylight barely touched the asphalt. After about 6 hours on the road, I pulled off onto an old dirt trail that curved deep into the woods. I didn't know where it led. I just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere away from people. After a few miles, I came across a clearing. Uneven ground, dead grass, a few broken fence posts, and at the edge of it stood an old wooden cabin. The roof was sagging in the middle, the paint had peeled down to gray wood, and the windows were clouded with dust. I figured it must have been abandoned for years. The place looked rough, but something about it felt perfect for what I needed. I parked the truck, got out, and walked around the cabin. The porch creaked under my boots. There was an old rocking chair missing one arm, and beside it a rusted lantern still hanging from a nail. The door was half open, swollen from rain, and when I pushed it, it let out a long, dry groan. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and dampness. Dust floated in the sunlight that slipped through cracks in the boards. The floor was uneven, warped by years of moisture. There was one small table with a broken leg, a metal bed frame without a mattress, and an old stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. In the corner, a pile of logs was covered with cobwebs. I set my bag down, cleared off a small space near the window, and decided this would do. I wasn't planning to stay long, maybe just a few days, enough to write in my journal, hike around, and get my thoughts straight. There was no signal on my phone, no sound of cars, not even birds. Just the wind sliding through the trees and the occasional crack of old wood shifting. That first night was cold. I built a small fire in the old stove and used my sleeping bag on the floor. The only sound was the fire popping every few seconds. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, feeling that kind of silence you only get far from civilization. It was peaceful, but also unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. Like the woods themselves were too quiet, as if everything had left for a reason. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. Behind it, there was a narrow trail that led deeper into the trees. I followed it for a while and came across what looked like an old well, covered with a sheet of metal and surrounded by weeds. The stones around it were cracked, and I could smell a faint, sour odor coming from inside. I didn't look too long. I walked further and found the remains of a small shed, half collapsed, with broken tools scattered inside. An old axe head, a rusted saw, a few glass jars with something long dried up inside. It felt like whoever had lived there just vanished one day and left everything behind. When I came back, I noticed something strange near the porch. The dirt around the front steps looked disturbed, fresh, almost like someone had walked there recently. The footprints were faint, but I was sure they weren't mine. I tried to brush it off as maybe an animal or something, but the prints were too human. That night, I didn't sleep well. The fire burned low, and I kept hearing small noises outside. Branches cracking, leaves moving, the kind of sounds that are normal in the woods but start to feel different when you're alone. At one point, I could have sworn I heard slow footsteps circling the cabin. I sat up and listened hard, but everything went quiet again. I stayed still until morning. By the third day, I started to feel uneasy being there. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been near the cabin since I arrived. I found small things out of place, a log that wasn't where I left it, a small dent in the dirt near the back window like a boot print. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just paranoid from being alone too long. That evening, I decided to walk to the main road before dark, just to make sure I could find my way back if I needed to leave quickly. It took me almost an hour to reach the road, and the walk back felt longer. The trees looked different somehow, like they were leaning in. By the time I got back to the clearing, it was almost dark. I noticed right away that the cabin door was wide open. I stood there for a minute, staring at it. I knew for a fact I had closed it before I left. My stomach sank. I slowly stepped onto the porch, careful not to make noise, and looked inside. Everything was still there. My bag, my sleeping bag, my food, but something had changed. My flashlight was on the floor, turned off, though I had left it on the table. Near the stove, I saw muddy footprints leading toward the back window. They were large, maybe size 12 or 13, definitely not mine. I checked the window, and it was cracked open, like someone had forced it. My first thought was maybe a hiker had taken shelter or some drifter had passed through. But the thing that bothered me most was the way the footprints stopped halfway across the room, like whoever it was had just stood there for a long time before leaving. That night, I barely slept at all. I kept the fire going, sitting upright against the wall, holding my small camping knife just in case. Every sound outside made me freeze. Around midnight, I heard something soft, slow, deliberate, like a hand brushing against the wall from outside. Then, a faint creak of the porch boards, one step at a time. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound stopped right outside the door. After what felt like hours, I heard the boards creak again, this time moving away. The silence that followed was the longest I've ever felt in my life. When daylight came, I packed everything up as fast as I could. Before leaving, I looked around one last time. The prints were there again, new ones this time right by the door, leading off into the woods. They were spaced far apart, like whoever it was had been running. I didn't wait to find out why. I got in my truck, turned the engine, and didn't look back until I reached the main road. About 20 miles later, I stopped at a gas station. The old man behind the counter saw the dirt and sweat on me and asked if I'd been hiking. I told him I'd been staying in an old cabin off the dirt trail north of here. He frowned when I said that and told me that land had been abandoned since the early 1980s after a man went missing out there. They found his truck near the road but never found him. I didn't say much after that. I just bought a bottle of water, sat in my truck, and stared at my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence, that someone had passed through, maybe living rough in the woods. But something about those footprints, the ones leading away from the cabin in long, running strides, still sticks with me. I never went back. I sold that truck a few months later and moved to a smaller apartment closer to town. But every now and then, when I can't sleep, I still think about that night. The sound of those slow steps on the porch, the way the boards bent under the weight of someone I never saw. And sometimes, when it's quiet and the air feels heavy like it did back in that forest, I swear I can still hear those same steps, moving slowly toward the door and then stopping just outside. It was October of 2019 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin I had rented in the Lake District, up in northern England. I had been working long hours at my job in Manchester and wanted to clear my head somewhere quiet. The cabin sat on a small hill, surrounded by dense woods, about 2 miles from the nearest village. The owner was an old man who rented it out to hikers during the summer, but by late autumn I was the only one around. He gave me the keys, told me to keep the wood stove burning at night, and warned me that the roads could get muddy if it rained. I didn't think much of it then. The first few days were calm. The weather stayed cold but clear, and I spent most of my time walking along the trails or sitting by the fire reading. The silence out there was heavy. No cars, no distant voices, just the occasional crow or the wind pushing through the trees. By the fourth night, I had settled into a routine. I'd cook a small meal, drink some tea, and sit outside with a flashlight to watch the mist roll across the hills. That was the night I first saw her. It was close to 10 p.m., and I had stepped out to bring in some logs for the fire. The air was cold enough that my breath came out white. The forest around the cabin looked darker than usual, the trees standing close together like a wall. I pointed my flashlight toward the edge of the clearing, and that's when I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I saw the outline of a person, a woman. She was standing just beyond the reach of the light, facing the cabin. She didn't move for several seconds, and I just stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. She was tall, thin, wearing something light-colored, maybe a coat or a dress. Her hair looked long and tangled, hanging over her shoulders. The odd thing was that she wasn't holding a flashlight, no lantern, nothing, just standing there, still. I blinked a few times, and when I pointed the light directly at her again, she was gone. I swept the beam around, but there was nothing, only trees and darkness. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe my eyes had played tricks on me. Still, I locked the cabin door that night, something I hadn't bothered doing before. I left the flashlight on the table beside me while I slept, just in case. The next morning, I checked around the cabin, half expecting to see footprints in the damp ground, but there were none. Everything looked untouched. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the treeline every few minutes. Even during the day, the woods felt different now, like they were hiding something. That afternoon, I went for a walk toward the small lake about a mile from the cabin. The path was muddy and covered in fallen leaves, and the air smelled of wet soil. I didn't see anyone on the way there, but as I got closer to the lake, I noticed something strange. On the far side of the shore, there was a small clearing with an old wooden bench. Sitting there was a woman, I stopped. She was facing the water, her back to me. The same tangled hair, the same pale coat. My stomach tightened. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. Then she slowly turned her head slightly, not fully toward me, just enough that I saw part of her face. That was enough. I turned and walked back the way I came, keeping my pace steady at first, but then faster when I reached the trail again. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and closed all the curtains. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but something about her face. It didn't look angry or threatening, just blank, empty, like she wasn't really seeing anything at all. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear branches hitting the roof and the sound of rain against the windows. I stayed by the fire for hours, trying to distract myself with a book, but my eyes kept drifting toward the door. Around midnight, the power went out. The light from the fire was the only thing keeping the room from being completely black. I went to check the generator outside, pulling on my jacket and boots. The rain had stopped, but the air was colder now. As I stepped out, my flashlight beam cut through the fog. I walked around the side of the cabin toward the small shed where the generator sat. Everything seemed quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. Then I saw something near the corner of the cabin, a shape standing near the woodpile. I raised the flashlight and my chest tightened. It was her again, closer this time, maybe 20 feet away. Her head tilted slightly, and I could see her face clearly under the beam. Pale skin, sunken eyes, lips pressed tightly together. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were damp and dirty. She didn't move, just stared right at me. I stepped back toward the door, keeping the light on her. I remember the way my heart was beating so loud it almost drowned out the wind. I unlocked the door and got inside as fast as I could. When I turned around to check through the window, she was gone again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching the flashlight, waiting for daylight. Every sound outside made me jump. The creak of the wood, the wind against the glass. When the sun finally came up, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bag and planned to leave early. When I stepped outside, I noticed footprints. Not mine. They were small and uneven, leading from the woods straight to the cabin door. Some of them looked fresh, pressed into the wet ground from the night's rain. My hands were shaking as I followed them a short way back toward the trees. The tracks disappeared near a fallen log, as if she had stepped around it and vanished into the forest. I started walking toward the road. The path was muddy, and the trees on both sides seemed to close in the further I went. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me. I didn't see her again, but I could feel it, that uneasy feeling of being watched. It took me almost an hour to reach the main road. When I finally saw my car parked where I'd left it, I felt a rush of relief. But as I got closer, I noticed something on the windshield, a smear, like someone had dragged their hand across the glass. I wiped it away with my sleeve, but the faint outline of a palm stayed there. I drove straight back to Manchester that morning. I didn't stop once, not even for food or fuel. The entire way, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone on the road behind me. But there was nothing, just empty highway and gray skies. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake what had happened. I tried to tell myself it was just some local woman, maybe someone living rough in the woods, but it didn't sit right. The cabin owner said no one lived anywhere nearby, and the way she moved, the silence of it, still bothers me. A month later, I read a local news article online about a missing woman. She had disappeared in the same area years before in 2016. They never found her. The picture in the article showed a woman with long hair and a light-colored coat. Her face looked almost exactly like the one I saw by the cabin. I haven't gone back to the Lake District since. I still think about that night sometimes. The way she stood there in the dark, the way her eyes didn't blink. And even now, whenever I see fog rolling across a quiet field or the outline of someone standing still in the distance, that feeling comes back. The same cold, hollow fear that I felt outside that cabin, knowing someone or something human was watching me, and I'd never understand why.